It all started with a tragedy. The kind of tragedy that changes a child's life forever. Clara was only 9 years old when the car she was in with her parents left the track in a treacherous curve and never returned. In a matter of seconds, everything she knew as home turned into silence, absence, pain. The ambulance arrived too late. Neighbors spoke in shock. The hospital recorded the deaths, and the girl, with her eyes still and her hands shaking, was the only one left in that back seat. There was no one to pick her up. No relatives showed up at the funeral. Not uncles, not cousins, not even a godfather. It was as if the world had become a place too big, too cold, and she, too small to continue alone. In the following days, social assistance officials tried to find out if there was any family member who could take custody. And then came the name of a single person, a maternal grandmother, living, rich, owner of a huge farm and a considerable fortune. That was all they knew. Clara barely remembered her. He had seen it only once on a distant Christmas, and even then the woman seemed oblivious, disconnected, impatient with everything that involved affection. Still, in the eyes of a 9-year-old, this unknown grandmother was the last hope. With a backpack on her back and a rag doll pressed against her chest, Clara was taken to the mansion where the woman who, in theory, was her family lived. The high gate, the manicured gardens, the uniformed servants, everything contrasted with the simplicity of the life she led with her parents. But none of that mattered. Clara just wanted a hug, a soft voice saying, "You're not alone." When she arrived, she was greeted by a housekeeper who, with an embarrassed look, led her into the living room. The grandmother entered minutes later. She wore an elegant dress, discreet jewelry, and carried with her the kind of rigidity that denounces a lifetime built on pride. He looked at the girl without emotion, as if analyzing an old piece of furniture, out of place. There was no hug. There was no smile. There was only a heavy silence, followed by a cold and definitive decision. Clara didn't quite understand what was happening, only saw her doll fall to the ground when an employee led her back to the assistance car. The grandmother had refused. He said he couldn't take care of another weight, that his life was too busy to deal with children, that she had already done enough for all her children and would not raise any granddaughter. He signed papers, authorized the transfer, and returned to his business, as if nothing had happened. The girl left there in silence. The car drove through the streets of the city as she tried to figure out what she had done wrong. He thought about his parents. I wondered if they would be sad to see that. I wondered if someday that void would be filled. The orphanage was the next destination. It wasn't what she wanted, but for now, it was all she had. If this story touched you, leave the like and subscribe to the channel. The story continues now. The rejection was like a blow that froze time for Clara. She was there in front of this woman who was supposed to be her refuge, her last safe haven, and yet she was treated as if she were a problem, an unwanted shadow that needed to be removed, quickly. Her grandmother, with an impassive face, looked at her as if Clara were invisible, as if the pain of that child, her plea for a little affection, meant absolutely nothing. There was no room for tears, nor for explanations. The only sound that echoed in the mansion's great room was the cutting silence of indifference. Clara tried to hold that woman's gaze. She looked for any sign of welcome in her words, but all she received was the coldness of rejection. The words heaviness and too many problems were etched in her mind, not as a passing criticism, but as a definitive sentence about who she was to that family. When the housekeeper returned to pick her up, she couldn't resist. The tears rolled uncontrollably, wetting her rag doll, now lying on the floor, as a symbol of the childhood she was missing at that moment. The path to the orphanage was silent, but the storm inside Clara grew with each kilometer traveled. She did not understand why someone who carried the blood of her parents could treat her with such cruelty. The feeling of abandonment was more than sadness. It was an emptiness, an open wound that hurt incessantly. But in the midst of that pain, something different began to form. A silent, almost invisible force sprang from the depths of his being, an iron determination that said that, no matter how much she was rejected and humiliated, she would not allow, her life to be defined by those moments of suffering. At the orphanage, the reality was harsh. The cold walls, the unfamiliar faces, and the rigid routine created an environment that had little to do with the warmth of a home. But Clara learned to adapt, to be strong even when everything seemed to fall apart. The years that followed were marked by silent battles, dealing with the absence of affection, bearing the weight of rejection, but also by building dreams. Among the difficulties, the girl never stopped dreaming of a different future, a future where she would have control of her own history. Education became his refuge. In the midst of books and studies, Clara found the chance to escape from that reality that suffocated her. As time went by, his determination translated into achievements. Each test overcome, each diploma won, was a small victory against the fate that seemed to want to bind her. The dream of justice began to be born along with it. Not just any justice, but one capable of correcting mistakes, repairing wounds, giving voice to those who were silenced. Clara grew up with the image of her grandmother hammering in her mind. The woman who rejected her so cruelly was not just a distant character, but a constant shadow who challenged her to prove her worth. The rejection that once made her feel small and insignificant now fed the strength of a young woman who wanted more than to survive. She wanted to win. The orphaned girl, who one day begged for help and was ignored, began to dream of a day when the scales of life could be balanced. The idea of justice is no longer just an abstract concept to become a personal mission. The road there would be long and difficult, but Clara would not give up. In each challenge, in each obstacle, there was the opportunity to grow, to become someone capable of making a difference. And so, with her head held high and her heart filled with silent purpose, Clara went on her way. Without looking back, without allowing rejection to define her. The wound of that afternoon never completely disappeared, but it also never stopped her from moving forward. On the contrary, it was the fuel that kept her moving, the constant reminder that as cruel as life could be, she had the strength to rewrite it. This strength was shaped in silence, between books and sleepless nights, between doubts and certainties. The girl who had once been invisible to her only family was now preparing to build her own identity, marked not by the pain of rejection, but by the courage to face it. A journey that would require more than physical strength. It would require resilience, intelligence, and an unbreakable will to change your destiny. The world that awaited her outside would not be kind. But Clara already knew that nothing would be more difficult than that closed door, that indifferent look. It was time to turn rejection into power, pain into motivation, abandonment into determination. The story of an orphan girl was just beginning, and she was determined to write each chapter with courage and justice. The reality of the orphanage was a harsh and unforgiving test for Clara. The simple walls, faded by time, housed many other children who, like her, had lost what they loved most. The environment was far from the warmth of a real home. Food was scarce and often tasteless, affection was rare, and heavy silence marked the days that seemed to have no end. The clock seemed to move slower in that place where time was diluted between rigid routines, strict rules, and a constant feeling of abandonment. Each day brought challenges new and old, and Claire felt the weight of loneliness in a deep way. But even in the midst of this arid scenery, there was a flame inside her that refused to go out. She knew that this was not her final destination, that the orphanage was not a home, and that there, in that place where so many children were forgotten, she needed to find the strength to get up with each fall. Clara discovered that while many succumbed to despair, she could turn her pain into fuel for the future. The tears did not cease to come. There were many, silent, and always in moments of solitude, when no one could see her. But instead of letting herself be consumed by them, she has learned to hide them, to keep them to herself, and to use this pain to feed her desire to change. The school, inside the orphanage, became his safest refuge. There, among old books and worn-out notebooks, Clara found the possibility of dreaming. He learned to read even earlier than expected, devoured stories and textbooks, absorbing everything with an unquenchable thirst. Knowledge was a window out of that cramped place with no prospects. She spent hours studying, in the improvised library or in any quiet corner, looking for a way to transcend the environment where she was. Gradually, the teachers began to notice his intelligence and dedication. Clara was not just any student. She was the one who, against all odds, stood out for her strength and perseverance. The contrast between the slight, silent girl who suffered inside the orphanage and the determined student who conquered space was stark. While many children lamented the absence of their family, Claire kept in her heart the image of the closed door of her grandmother's mansion, the one who did not want to welcome her. She didn't harbor anger nor resentment, but the closed door became a symbol of what she never wanted for her life: rejection, dependence, and emptiness. This image became a constant reminder, a silent beacon that guided his steps towards a different, more just and dignified future. Even with the heavy routine, Clara never let herself be overwhelmed by the lack of comfort or the absence of a welcoming home. The difficult moments reinforced his resilience. In the midst of difficulties, she made small promises to herself, promises that one day she would be able to repay all the love she did not receive, to help those who, like her, were forgotten or rejected. The dream of justice was not only an intellectual aspiration, but a personal commitment born of the profound experience of abandonment and pain. Adolescence brought new battles. Growing up in foster care meant dealing with constant instability. House moves, changing caregivers, the pressure of adapting to new rules, and the permanent feeling of being on the margins. Clara saw friends leave, some without ever returning, others taken to families who did not always want to really welcome them. She herself faced moments of doubt, sleepless nights, and the constant fear of not being good enough, of not being able to get out of that cycle. But at the same time, the girl who one day knocked on the door of the mansion for help and was rejected became a young woman who not only faced the world, but who sought to transform it. Books remained her shield and her sword, and she knew that education was the surest way to change her story. Clara began to imagine the future more concretely. She dreamed of being someone who could make a difference, of making sure that no other child would go through the pain of rejection that she had known so well. The image of that closed door, which one day symbolized her greatest abandonment, was now the spark that fed her will to fight, to overcome herself, and above all, to conquer, a place where she could rule, not as a victim, but as a protagonist. It was the drive to prove that she could be more than a rejected girl. She could be a strong, respected woman, capable of commanding her own story. And so, between silent tears and devoured pages, Clara built the foundation of what would become her life, a trajectory of courage, resistance, and determination. She knew that the path would be long and arduous, that the difficulties would not end here, but she also knew that there, at that moment, she was taking the first steps to transform her destiny. Because, more than surviving, Clara wanted to win, and nothing could stop her, and it was with this determined heart and a mind full of dreams that she began to prepare for her return, not as an orphaned and rejected girl, but as someone who would not only seek justice for herself, but for all those who were once forgotten. Leaving the orphanage marked for Clara the beginning of a new stage, an even more challenging chapter, but full of hope. At the age of 18, with a backpack on her back and her gaze fixed on an uncertain future, she faced the world with a courage that few people can muster in one heart. The scholarship certificate was more than a piece of paper. It was the symbol of years of struggle, sleepless nights, and an incessant effort to prove to herself that she would not be defined by the past, but by the choices made in the present. Her first job as an attendant in a small store was her direct contact with the reality that many try to ignore. Long journeys, days when exhaustion seemed to have no end, and food was just what was left at the end of the day, sometimes a quick and cheap snack, other times just hunger that needed to be postponed until the next moment. Clara learned to dribble. Her fatigue, to keep her head up even when her body asked for rest. Work was not just a source of income, it was a school of life, a place where I developed skills that would go beyond books: patience, empathy, resilience. The evenings were reserved for study. Law school, conquered with effort and a lot of determination, was a constant challenge, but also the dream that fueled her sleepless nights. Each page read, each concept learned, each class attended diligently was a brick placed in the construction of his new identity. The fatigue hit hard, but the desire to become someone capable of transforming the system, of doing real justice, was greater. Clara knew that her story was that of many who live on the margins, and that to change this reality, she needed to be armed with knowledge and courage. The years passed, and Clara conquered her space. Internships in law firms were the doors that slowly opened to a promising career. Between lawsuits, hearings, and a lot of dedication, the young woman who was once rejected by her own family began to gain recognition. Step by step, the approvals in public exams were reaffirming his capacity and determination. Nothing came easy. Each victory was the result of a superhuman effort, of a daily struggle against the insecurities and limitations imposed by the past and by the social condition. And then, the long-awaited day finally arrived. The news of her appointment as a judge seemed for many like a fairy tale, but for Clara, it was the consecration of a trajectory built with sweat, tears, and a strength that no one could break. The girl who knocked on her grandmother's door in search of a home and was rejected now had in her hands the power to do justice, to decide and influence destinies. It was living proof that destiny can be rewritten, that abandonment does not have to be the end, but a starting point for something greater. Behind the toga and the title, Clara carried the memory of those difficult days, the image of the closed door, the echo of hidden tears and the silence of the orphanage. Every step taken in that court was a quiet victory against the rejection that once tried to define her. The driving force behind her came from an unshakable conviction. Justice was not just an abstract concept but a personal mission, and above all a commitment to those who, like her, have already been forgotten. The road there had been long, marked by obstacles that could have destroyed many, but that only strengthened Clara. She knew that the title of judge was a powerful tool, but that true change would require more than judicial decisions. It required empathy, sensitivity, courage to confront the system, and the determination to never forget where it came from. It was the beginning of a new battle, different from the ones he had faced before, but with the same unbreakable spirit. At that moment, Clara was in a place where many dreams are lost along the way, but she had managed to keep hers alive, pulsing, strong and clear. His trajectory was proof that the past, as painful as it was, does not define who we are, and that the true strength is in always getting up, even when everything seems to conspire against it. Thus, with the toga on and the responsibility in her hands, Clara was preparing to face a new world, where the power to change stories was now in her decisions. Each process, each sentence, would be a chance to do justice not only for themselves, but for all those who still dream of a future where abandonment and rejection are not the end of the line. And as she prepared to take the next steps in this new role, the certainty that her journey was far from over was clear. For true transformation begins when you take control of your own story, and Clara was ready to write the most important chapter of her life. If you liked this story, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Clara, now a strong and determined woman, carried with her more than the weight of the title and responsibilities that her position required. She was a figure of respect in the legal environment and in the community where she worked, known for her firm ethical stance and a sensitivity that few expected to find in a judge. His fame came not only from his just sentences, but from the way he exercised authority, without arrogance, without contempt, always with empathy. That was the mark she wanted to leave, the one she didn't find one day when she needed it most. The respect she gave to others was a reflection of the dignity she herself sought, and this search accompanied her every day. The woman Claire had become was admired not only for her intellect and competence, but also for the righteous heart that guided her decisions. She knew that justice could not be blind to the stories behind the lawsuits, and that is why each case was treated humanely. It was impossible to forget the girl who knocked on a closed door, the orphanage where she learned to survive with very little, the sleepless nights studying so as never to depend on anyone again. These memories were engraved in her soul, shaping not only the professional, but the person who refused to be cold in the face of the suffering of others. Even with all the achievements and recognition, there was a void, a part of it that still remained inaccessible, a story that was not completely told, an unfinished chapter that life insisted on keeping open. The emptiness was not of achievements, nor of accomplishments, but of the absence of that family that rejected her, of the grandmother who never wanted to take her in. It was the silent pain of someone who knows that part of his past has not yet been digested, and that to really move forward, it would be necessary to face what has been avoided for so long. Clara lived between hearings, lawsuits, and decisions that affected the lives of many people, but she also carried with her the urgency of closing that personal cycle. The wound that the rejection had left never completely healed. It was a constant reminder that, as much as the world recognized her strength and capacity, there was still a piece of her story that needed attention, that cried out for closure. That feeling drove her, but it also left her vulnerable, a vulnerability she kept to herself, away from the eyes of the courtroom and the public. Over the years, she realized that true power was not only in the toga, nor in the laws she mastered, but in the ability to confront her own shadows, to face the hardest things in life, and still choose to move forward. Clara understood that the justice she wanted for the world began with the justice she needed for herself, that the strength he had built was also an invitation to allow himself to feel, to seek the peace he never had. The road was long, but now she was ready for it, armed with all the experience, knowledge, and courage she never imagined she possessed. This moment in her life, when recognition and professional fulfillment went hand in hand with the restlessness of the past, was a turning point. Clara knew that life still had surprises in store, that fate had not finished writing its script. The doors that were previously closed could open again, not with rejection, but with possibilities of healing and reunion. The chapter that still needed to be closed was more than a personal matter. It was the key for her to finally be able to free herself from what held her back and embrace her entire life, with all its pains and victories. With this awareness, Clara went on her way, immersed in a routine that demanded a lot from her, but also full of small daily achievements that gave meaning to her work and her existence. She learned to balance the strength of the woman that life demanded her to be with the delicacy of someone who still carries deep scars, but does not allow them to define her value or her destiny. It was this balance that made her so unique, so human, and that aroused respect and admiration in all who knew her. Clara's gaze was now turned to a horizon where past and present could finally meet, where the loose pieces of her story could be brought together to form a whole. It was the moment when the woman she had become began to prepare herself to face what she had avoided until then, moved by the certainty that true justice begins within herself. The judge's righteous heart beat strongly, ready to deal with whatever came, carrying in each beat the hope of a full, whole life, finally reconciled with its own origins. And as her life continued to unfold between cases, decisions, and the intense routine of the courtroom, Clara felt that something deeper was about to happen, something that could transform not only her story, but also the meaning of everything she had experienced until then. The emptiness she felt, the open wound, and the silent strength that had always driven her were about to meet, setting the stage for a journey of self-knowledge, forgiveness, and redemption that would change her life forever. Clara couldn't help but be shocked to discover that the lawsuit that had just fallen into her hands involved a person who was part of her past, the very woman who, years ago, had rejected her without any compassion, the grandmother who left her behind when she needed it most. The revelation came as a silent blow, a strange sensation that mixed incredulity and a chill down my spine. It was a delicate situation, and at the same time deeply personal. However, the judge knew that her commitment was to justice and not to the ghosts of the past. So he decided to take the case as seriously as he did any other, aware that he could not allow emotion to contaminate his judgment. Still, the mind was racing, trying to process what it meant. It was not just any process. It was a moment in which fate challenged her to face not only the law, but her own feelings. As she prepared for the hearing, Clara reviewed the documents with extra attention, analyzing the evidence and reports that pointed to fraud and mistreatment. Each page she read deepened the whirlwind of emotions she tried to control. He knew that more than the simple application of the law was at stake here, was the possibility of ending a cycle that had accompanied her since childhood. The weight of the past seemed to materialize on those sheets of paper, but the judge maintained the firm and objective posture that characterized her. It was a testament to his strength, a silent battle between duty and the memories that insisted on emerging. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was full, as always. When the door opened and Clara's grandmother entered the room, the mood changed. The woman, with a closed face and tired look, did not immediately recognize the figure that was waiting for her on the other side of the table. The room became silent, the eyes crossed, tense and loaded with an unspoken story. Until the surname uttered echoed in that environment, and something in the grandmother's expression changed. His face turned pale, his eyes widened, and an instant of doubt set in. That moment, brief and intense, carried all the complexity of an unexpected reunion where past and present collided abruptly. Clara felt the impact of the situation but did not back down. The professionalism and integrity she had built over the years sustained her at that decisive moment. She understood that, in addition to the tension that the case carried, there was a unique opportunity to break with the old pain and look the truth in the face. The courtroom, which had so often been the scene of other people's stories, now became the stage where her own story gained a new chapter. The grandmother, for her part, seemed lost between shock and resistance, facing a reality she had long tried to ignore. Despite the painful past, Clara maintained the serenity necessary to conduct the hearing. His firm gaze and calm voice were instrumental in ensuring that the process was conducted in a fair and transparent manner. Every word, every decision, carried not only the responsibility of a judge, but also the will to transform that situation, no matter how difficult it was, into a step towards the truth and justice that she had always sought. The tension in the room was palpable, but Clara didn't allow that to shake her resolve. The unfolding of the hearing brought to light facts that, for many present, seemed just technical details, but for Clara, they meant the confirmation of a much bigger story. The evidence showed a clear picture of neglect and abuse, a reality she knew closely, although she had never had the courage to name until then. The weight of this realization made his heart sink, but it also strengthened his conviction that justice needed to be done, regardless of painful ties or memories. It was a moment when the judge became, in fact, the voice of those who had no voice, including the girl who was once abandoned. At the end of the hearing, the room remained silent, and Clara knew that this was only the first step in a process that would involve many emotions and challenges. However, her firm stance and unwavering commitment made it clear that she was not there to open old wounds out of pure revanchism, but to ensure that the truth was recognized and that justice fulfilled its role. The reunion with her grandmother, although unexpected, was an inevitable chapter in her story, and Clara was ready to face it, determined not to let the past dictate her future, but instead to propel her towards transformation. The judge understood that this moment was a watershed, an opportunity for old secrets to be unraveled and for the truth to emerge with all its force. The court, the usual scene of decisions and judgments, now witnessed a meeting loaded with symbolism where each word uttered had the weight of a lifetime. Clara, with her experience and sensitivity, was prepared to conduct this process not only with the legal technique, but with the humanity she always cultivated. After all, that story was not only hers. It was the story of so many people who, like her, faced abandonment, pain, and the struggle for a place in the sun. As the next few days unfolded, Clara stood firm, facing each challenge with the courage that defined her. He knew that the journey would not be easy, that the consequences of that reunion could reverberate far beyond the walls of the court. But she also knew that it was exactly at this point that true justice began, in the courage to face the past, in decisions that require not only reason but heart. The process that had begun with a name on a document now came to life, turned into a battle for truth, for reparation, and above all, for dignity. The judge walked through this complex web of emotions and responsibilities, aware that the weight of her decision exceeded the limits of the law, touching directly on the human essence. It was a fight that transcended the professional and invaded the personal. A duel between what was and what could still be. Clara, despite all her strength, also felt the emotional impact of that situation, but she used this strength to stand, firm not to allow the story that marked her to paralyze her. She was there to change the fate of that story, and that required the greatest courage she ever had. The atmosphere in the courtroom reflected the intensity of that moment, the attentive looks, the discreet whispers, the heavy silence. Everything contributed to that case becoming a milestone not only in Clara's career but in her personal life. It was a meeting point between past and present, between pain and justice, between rejection and redemption. Every decision made, every word spoken, was a step on this path that cried out for a deep and true resolution. Clara knew that she could not let fear or insecurity overwhelm her. I needed to be firm, to be fair, to be human. At the end of that phase of the hearing, Clara felt that something was changing inside her. The feeling of emptiness began to give way to a new feeling, a discreet but firm hope that this reunion, although painful, could be the beginning of a new story. A history where the past would no longer be a burden but a lesson, an impulse for justice to be more than a concept, but a reality lived by all. And it was exactly this feeling that kept her standing, ready for the challenges that were yet to come, sure that the path she had chosen was the only possible one. As the courtroom lights went out at the end of the day, Clara knew that the journey ahead would require even more of her courage and determination. The unexpected meeting with her grandmother, the process that unfolded, the memories that resurfaced, all this formed a complex and challenging scenario. But it was also a unique opportunity for that woman, who had once been a rejected girl, to finally write the ending she always wanted for her story. Justice, which once seemed distant and unattainable, was now within her reach, not only as a judge but as a daughter, granddaughter, and human being. With this awareness, Clara prepared herself to face whatever came with the strength that life had taught her to cultivate. Every step taken in that courtroom was a victory against the past, an affirmation that justice can be done, even when the truth is painful. The unexpected reunion was not only a moment to judge facts, but to reconcile wounds, to seek a balance between reason and feeling. It was a crucial chapter, where the woman that Clara had become found the girl she once was, and together they began to build a future where justice and humanity go hand in hand. And as the courtroom doors closed behind her grandmother, Clara felt that the story that had accompanied her for so long was finally transforming. That case, more than a lawsuit, was an invitation for her to continue the journey, driven by hope and the certainty that, no matter how difficult the battles are, it is possible to find light even in the densest shadows. The transformation that was happening there at that moment was just the beginning. The silence that took over the courtroom needed no words to express what they both felt at that moment. Clara and her grandmother stared at each other, each carrying in their eyes the weight of years of silence, heartaches, and untold stories. The air seemed dense, charged with pent-up emotions that finally exploded in a moment of tense calm. The grandmother, once a tough, impassive, and authoritative woman in her own home, now showed herself vulnerable, fragile before that granddaughter, who some time ago she did not hesitate to abandon. It was a meeting between past and present, between the power she had once possessed and the powerlessness that now consumed her. Her hands trembled, her eyes avoided direct contact, but Clara's presence, firm and decisive, seemed almost like an anchor that bound her to reality. Clara, in turn, felt that sorrowful look, mixed with fear, and maybe even a little regret. But she didn't let that distract her from her role at that moment. She knew that it was not the time for revenge, to open wounds only for the bitter taste of revenge. His commitment was to justice, to the truth, and to people who often had no voice to defend their rights. Maintaining one's posture was the most difficult and at the same time most necessary act. In that courtroom there was no room for personal feelings, although they were all there, palpable and intense. Pulsating silently between every unspoken word, every contained gesture. The trial proceeded in a freezing atmosphere, marked by a tension that seemed to freeze time. Clara led each step with the precision of someone who knows the law deeply, but also with the sensitivity of someone who understands the human drama behind each process. She read the testimonies, analyzed the evidence, and listened to the witnesses, always maintaining a firm and serene tone without ever allowing her personal history to interfere with the course of the trial. The room, full of people who followed the case, felt the weight of that singular moment. The granddaughter who had become a judge before the accused grandmother, the woman who finally had to answer for her actions. For the grandmother, this was an unprecedented and terrifying moment. For the first time in her life, she was in the position of someone who needed to listen, without being able to interrupt, command, or flee. The words that came from Clara were not just sentences from a judge. They were the echo of a voice that, years ago, she had ignored and rejected. Her impotence manifested itself not only by the formality of the courtroom, but by the reality that time, circumstances, and justice had now placed her on the other side, vulnerable and exposed. The room seemed to compress the space, transforming the environment into a stage where personal and institutional dramas were inseparably intertwined. As the hours progressed, Clara realized how much that process had gone beyond the legal scope, to become a true internal battle, a crossing between reason and heart. But she didn't let herself be carried away by the emotion that threatened to invade her. Every decision, every question, was an affirmation of his commitment to justice, not to the pain of the past. The grandmother, faced with that situation, seemed smaller and smaller, fragmented between the memories of a past in which she was in charge and the current reality in which she needed to defend herself. It was a role reversal that he had never imagined he would face, and one that left a deep mark on everyone who watched that hearing. Despite the coldness necessary for the process, the silence between Clara and her grandmother remained a constant presence. Like a mute witness of that meeting loaded with meaning, the judge's firm gaze conveyed the strength she had built up over the years, the determination not to allow injustice to prevail, even though she herself was part of the painful story that unfolded there. The grandmother, in turn, felt cornered, without the protection she once used to hide her flaws and weaknesses. And in that silent confrontation, the scales of justice seemed to tip toward a future where the truth would finally have its place, no matter what the cost. The hearing took its course, marked by moments of palpable tension, but also by the clarity that came from the evidence presented. Clara remained tireless, demanding answers, confronting testimonies and paving the way for the truth to emerge in the midst of so much suffering and manipulation. She knew that this trial was not just a judicial matter, it was a symbolic act, an attempt to rescue lost dignity and to bring to light what had been hidden for so long. Her every word reinforced the importance of the role she played, not only as a judge, but as someone who had the mission of protecting the vulnerable and enforcing the rights of those who suffered. Behind the coldness of the law, however, pulsated a complex human story, full of invisible scars. The look that Clara cast at her grandmother was at the same time a mirror and a reminder of everything that had been experienced, of everything that was left behind. That silence that spoke more than any words held not only sorrows, but also a silent opportunity for reconstruction, an invitation for justice to be more than a cold verdict, and to become a path to healing, to reparation, and to the possibility of a new beginning. And so, as the trial progressed, Clara's presence grew stronger and stronger, not only as a legal authority, but as a symbol of the strength that comes when one has the courage to face the past and transform it. The grandmother, in turn, had to deal with the reality she had previously denied, understanding, albeit belatedly, that she could no longer control the narrative with rigid hands and harsh words. Now in that courtroom, justice was conducted by a woman who carried her story, who knew the pains of rejection and abandonment up close, but who also knew that true strength lies in the ability to overcome. The process followed its rhythm, every detail being meticulously analyzed, while Clara maintained the composure and clarity that always marked her performance. The tension, though present, was beginning to morph into something different, a quiet energy that carried the hope that, despite the hardships, the truth would prevail. And in that very formal and impersonal setting that is the court, a deeply personal story gained space to be told, understood, and perhaps one day overcome. That day marked not only an important chapter in Clara's career, but also a turning point in her life. The reunion with her grandmother, the trial, the eloquent silence that took over the room. All this indicated that, as harsh as the reality was, there was a greater force at play, a force capable of transforming wounds into learning, pain into justice, silence into truth. The road would be long and full of obstacles, but the judge was prepared to move forward, guided by the certainty that the path to true justice is never easy, but always worth taking. The moment the last witnesses were heard and the evidence was finalized, Clara felt the responsibility growing even more. Justice, which had previously seemed distant and abstract, was now there, palpable and urgent, demanding from it not only the fulfillment of the law, but the application of its own wisdom, ethics and humanity. The grandmother, motionless and silent, faced the moment with a mixture of fear and acceptance, while Clara stood firm, aware that this was only the beginning of a process that would require even more firmness and courage. The tension that dominated. The environment began to give way to an atmosphere full of expectation and reflection. Every look in that room sought to understand not only what was being judged, but what those people represented as living symbols of the consequences of past and present decisions. Claire felt in herself the weight of this responsibility, but also the strength that came from the conviction that, even in the most difficult moments, justice can open paths for transformation and reconciliation. And it was with this awareness that she followed, ready for the next steps to come, aware that in that silent battle, every gesture and every word would make all the difference. When the moment of decision finally arrived, the courtroom was filled with a heavy, almost palpable silence, as if the very air held its breath under the weight of that sentence. Clara felt the weight of responsibility like never before. It was not simply a legal issue, but the culmination of a history marked by pain, abandonment, and resistance. The verdict did not represent an act of revenge, nor a simple punishment. It was, above all, a recognition of the responsibility that needed to be assumed, a necessary step so that justice could find its way, and the past, finally, could be confronted, as the words were spoken, flowing with serenity and clarity. The grandmother remained motionless, as if processing not only the sentence, but all that it meant to her life and to the relationships she had once destroyed. There was no crying, no outburst of anger or pleading, just a resigned silence that showed that this woman finally understood the weight of the consequences. Justice, once distant and abstract, now materialized before her, demanding not only reparation, but also a transformation, a moment of deep reflection on the choices that led there. Clara, for her part, stood firm, the serenity on her face reflecting the conviction that, despite everything, this verdict was a step towards something greater. She was not there to punish out of spite, but to ensure that the balance between right and duty was respected. The strength that emanated from her at that time transcended the formal role of judge. It was the expression of a woman who knew the pain of abandonment and, even so, chose to act with justice and balance, demonstrating a wisdom that few can achieve in the face of situations so charged with emotion. When the sentence was officially proclaimed, there was a sense of closure that did not need to be expressed in words. The grandmother stood up slowly, her body heavy as if the weight of the decision was almost physical. Clara watched her, realizing that at that moment, between them, there was no more room for resentment. The look they exchanged contained no anger, no reproach, but a complex mixture of relief, acceptance, and the acknowledgement that the cycle was finally closing. For both, that moment meant more than the end of a trial. It was the possibility of liberation from the invisible chains that bound them to a painful past. The judge made a restrained gesture, a discreet, almost imperceptible nod, before turning to leave the room. The weight of that decision was still present, but inside her there was an unprecedented feeling that she no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Victory was already achieved, not in courts, but in overcoming internal pain, in the courage to face what many avoid. Justice. On that day was more than a word. It was an act of transformation, a milestone that would forever change the trajectory of two women whose lives were intertwined by complex bonds and ultimately by an undeniable truth. As the room began to empty, the people watching the process were still absorbing the impact of that singular moment. The story told there went beyond the boundaries of the courtroom, touching the essence of what justice, forgiveness, and responsibility mean. The figure of the grandmother, once imposing and unattainable, now showed her weaknesses, and Clara, in the position of judge and granddaughter, personified the strength that arises when one chooses to face reality with courage and determination. It was an encounter between past and present, between error and reparation, which left deep marks but also opened space for new paths. The tension that hovered in the room was replaced by a different energy, less heavy, lighter, but still loaded, with meaning. Justice, although formal and ruthless, showed its most human side at that moment, revealing that behind legal decisions there are life stories, feelings, and opportunities for change. Clara knew that this was just one step in a larger process, a journey that involved not only her and her grandmother, but all the people who, in some way, were touched by that web of broken relationships and attempts to rebuild. As she walked to leave the room, the judge felt the presence of that moment as a bridge between what was and what could become. It was not a matter of erasing the past or forgetting the pains, but of integrating them, recognizing that true justice goes beyond punishment and sentence. It is a force capable of transforming, of bringing to light what was hidden, and of opening paths for reconstruction and reunion, even if these processes are slow and complex. The final look that Clara cast at the woman who denied her so much in the past carried this silent message. There was no room for grudges, but there was an invitation, even if unspoken, for life to move on with dignity and respect. That was the essence of that moment, an encounter between justice and humanity, between the past that weighs and the future that presents itself full of possibilities. As the door closed behind her, the feeling that a cycle was ending was consolidated. But it also awakened the awareness that stories of pain and overcoming never end completely. They just transform, gain new contours, and, in many cases, offer deep learning for everyone involved. Clara knew that the battle in that courtroom was part of a larger process, a journey that required not only strength and courage, but also an openness to the unexpected, to what was yet to come. It was impossible to ignore the impact of that judgment, not only for those two women, but for everyone who accompanied and who in some way reflected on their own experiences. Justice had fulfilled its role, yes, but the true transformation was far from being an immediate end result. It was a continuous journey, an invitation for wounds to be seen, welcomed, and little by little healed. Thus, while the courtroom emptied and the lights began to go out, a new stage was on the horizon. Claire carried within herself the strength and conviction that, even when all seems lost, it is possible to find a path of reconstruction and redemption. The past had been confronted, the silence broken, and responsibilities assumed. Now, it was time to move forward, with the certainty that true justice is never simple, but always necessary, and that sometimes the end of a chapter is just the beginning of a new story. The achievement that Clara achieved went far beyond simple formal recognition, the validation of a position or the confirmation of a social role. She had achieved something that few people can achieve in their entire lives: emotional freedom. This freedom was not the result of chance, nor was it a gift granted without effort. She was the result of an arduous and intense process, which involved facing the pain that had consumed her for so long, facing the rejections that marked her trajectory, and overcoming the abandonment that seemed destined to define her. This freedom was the true triumph, the sign that the inner transformation had taken place and that, finally, the invisible prison of resentments and hurts had been broken. In the course of that process, Clara discovered that pain, while inevitable, did not have to be a permanent burden. On the contrary, when channeled with awareness and courage, it could become an inexhaustible source of motivation and learning. Transforming suffering into strength was not just a catchphrase, it was a concrete reality that permeated each of her actions, each step taken towards the reconstruction of herself. This profound transformation required her to look within, to accept her vulnerability, and at the same time to find within herself an unprecedented courage to move forward, even when everything seemed to conspire to keep her in the past. This achievement was, in many ways, a renaissance. Like the phoenix that rises from its ashes, Clara emerged from a story marked by pain and conflict, not as a victim, but as a renewed woman, aware of her worth and able to control her narrative. His trajectory made it clear that no one is defined exclusively by what he suffered or what was taken from him, but by what he chooses to do with what he carries. This perspective not only allowed her to overcome the most difficult obstacles, but also prepared her to positively influence the lives of others, showing that true victory lies in mastery of oneself, in the freedom conquered over the emotions that so often imprison. The process of overcoming it required Clara to build a bridge between the painful past and the future she wished to create. This bridge was neither simple nor fast. It was made of constant effort, difficult choices, and, above all, the firm decision not to allow old wounds to define who she was. With each step, she consolidated her inner strength, learning to accept life's imperfections and to find beauty in the struggle for reconciliation and forgiveness, even when it seemed distant or impossible. This journey of self-knowledge and transformation was the true foundation for the freedom that now pulsated in her heart. More than a matter of external justice, Claire achieved an inner justice, one that does not depend on the gaze of others, but on the deep recognition of her own worth. This kind of justice is quiet, discreet, but powerful. It modifies not only the perception we have of ourselves, but also the way we relate to the world around us. The emotional freedom she conquered changed the way she faced people, conflicts, and even moments of difficulty, which came to be seen not as threats but as opportunities for growth and learning. This transformation was visible in his gaze, in his calm posture, in the balance that emanated from each gesture. Clara has become a living example that the power to transform one's own life is in the hands of each one, as long as there is a willingness to face what bothers us, to break through the invisible barriers of fear and guilt, and to embrace the possibility of true change. She showed that pain does not have to be a destination, but can be the starting point for a surprising and meaningful journey. Its history, marked by twists and challenges, has made it clear that true victory lies not in the absence of problems, but in the ability to overcome them with wisdom and courage. This freedom that Clara now enjoyed also brought with it a new sense of responsibility. Emotional freedom is not synonymous with carelessness or lack of commitment, but with a full awareness of the impact of your choices and actions, both for yourself and for the people around you. The emotional maturity she gained made her not only stronger, but also more empathetic, able to understand the complexity of human relationships and the value of forgiveness and compassion, even in the face of the flaws and limitations that we all carry. Clara understood that in order to move forward, it was necessary not only to free herself from the shackles of the past, but also to build a new path based on solid principles, which included respect, truth, and authenticity. These values began to guide his decisions and strengthen his purpose, giving meaning to each new stage he faced. This trajectory was not linear, much less easy, but it was marked by determination and the certainty that personal transformation is the greatest gift someone can give themselves. Clara's profound transformation reverberated beyond her own life, touching those who knew her and even those who heard her story. His example illuminated paths, showing that even in the most complex situations, it is possible to rediscover hope and rebuild one's own history. It became living proof that the past does not have to be a definitive sentence, but can be the fuel for a future full of possibilities and achievements. The emotional freedom conquered by Clara also made room for her to reconnect with herself in a more genuine way, valuing her own needs, dreams, and limits. This reunion with herself was fundamental for her to be able to establish healthier and more balanced relationships, removing the weight of old hurts and cultivating the serenity necessary to live fully. The awareness of her own strength helped her to break cycles and patterns that previously seemed unbreakable, opening the doors to a new way of being in the world. As she reflected on all that she had experienced and overcome, Claire realized that the true victory was not public recognition or confirmation of material justice, but the reconquest of her own identity, her inner peace, and the ability to look to the future with hope and confidence. This silent but powerful victory was the basis for her to move forward, free from the shackles that had imprisoned her for so many years. In every gesture, in every thought, Clara now carried the certainty that true transformation is born from within, that the strength to overcome adversity is within each person, waiting to be awakened. The journey until then was marked by battles and discoveries, by confrontations and learning, which shaped the woman she became and who was still in constant evolution. The meaning of that achievement transcended the individual because it showed the universality of the human struggle against its own shadows and limitations. Clara's emotional freedom was at the same time an invitation and a challenge for everyone to reflect on how to deal with their own pains and pasts, on how to seek justice that goes beyond the courts and sentences, a justice that is built in the heart and in the mind. With this deep understanding, Clara was ready to continue her journey, knowing that true victory is a continuous process of self-knowledge, overcoming and growth. The freedom conquered was not an endpoint, but a constant invitation to continue exploring the paths of life with courage, wisdom, and renewed hope. That moment symbolized not only the end of a stage, but the beginning of a new phase, in which inner strength and the ability to transform pain into learning would be her greatest allies, opening increasingly wider horizons for the future she wanted to build. This story reminds us that even in the worst rejections, there is the possibility of overcoming, rebuilding, and being reborn, that those who live pain today can tomorrow inspire many with their strength and transformation, and that, in the end, good, even when it seems distant, always finds its way. If this journey touched you in any way, leave a like here so we know that this connection made sense. Take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, because here there is always content designed to bring more clarity and strength to those who face similar challenges. And if you want, comment down there with the phrase, "This message was for me," so we know who has come this far and is walking together. There's a video here on the side that tells a similar story. Click and stay with me there. The walk continues, and there are many good things waiting for you.